She was Luna of the most powerful wolf kingdom on Earth, and he destroyed her in 60 seconds flat. No trial, no mercy. Just a king who chose fury over truth and called it justice. Alpha King Darian Blackthorne tore the crown from her hair in front of 10,000 witnesses, and not one of them stopped him. Not one. What nobody knew, what he never knew, was what she carried out of those palace gates into the dark. This is the story of a woman who survived the impossible and a king who spent years learning what he'd truly thrown away. Stay until the end, like this if your loyalty runs bone deep, and drop your city below. This one's for the pack. She remembered the exact weight of the crown the first time Darian placed it on her head. Not the ceremony, not the silk draped across her shoulders, not the roar of 10,000 wolves lifting their voices to the night sky. She remembered the weight, cold and precise, settling into her hair like something that had always been meant to sit there. Darian's hands had trembled slightly. She'd felt it, even through the ceremony's rigid protocol. And when she'd looked up at him, the expression on his face had been something she'd spent the 3 years of their courtship trying to learn how to read. Not love, exactly. Something older than love. Something that looked like a man recognizing a fundamental fact of his own existence. That had been 4 years ago. She'd been 22. She hadn't known yet that recognition could be revoked. Seraphina Vale woke before dawn on the morning everything ended, the same way she'd woken every morning since she'd taken her place at Darian's side. Alert, body already cataloging threats before her eyes were fully open. It was a habit the palace hadn't given her. She'd arrived with it from the frontier territories where she'd been raised, from years in the Ashvale borderlands where the distinction between sleeping and waking lightly could mean the difference between drawing breath in the morning and not. The palace had softened some things, her accent partially, the calluses on her hands mostly, the instinct, never. The chamber was dark. Darian's side of the bed was empty and cold, which meant he'd been gone for hours. That wasn't unusual. The king rarely slept past the 3rd hour of night. What was unusual was the quality of the silence outside the chamber door. Palace silence had texture. The silence of servants moving carefully, of guards rotating on schedule, of a household operating below the surface like a machine built for discretion. She'd learned to read it the way she'd once read wind direction in the Asheville plains. This silence was different, held, the kind that happened when people were waiting for something. She dressed without calling her ladies. That was the second instinct, an old one, deeper than the palace could reach. When the air felt wrong, you dressed yourself. You didn't hand anyone else control of whether you were ready. She was still lacing her outer robe when the knock came, not her ladies. Not the soft, deferential tap of the women assigned to her quarters. This knock was knuckle-heavy, practiced, the knock of someone who delivered messages that changed the shape of rooms. Luna Vale, Captain Aldrich's voice, flat and precise. His Majesty requests your presence in the Great Hall. She noted, with the part of her mind that never stopped cataloging, that he had called her Luna Vale and not Luna Blackthorne. She had never formally taken the king's name. The ceremony had not yet occurred. But every member of the palace staff had stopped using her birth name the week after her coronation. Aldrich was not a man who made slips. Every word he chose was deliberate. Tell the king I'll be down in 10 minutes, she said. His Majesty requests your presence immediately. She opened the door. Aldrich stood with 2 additional guards she recognized from the throne room detail. The king's personal rotation, not hers. His face was the face he wore when he was performing a function he found distasteful, which in 4 years she'd seen exactly 3 times. His eyes didn't meet hers. Captain, she said, what's in the hall? His Majesty will explain. She followed them down the corridor. The Great Hall of Thornwall Palace had been built to overwhelm. Darian's great-great-grandfather, a king with a talent for architectural intimidation, had designed the room so that anyone entering from the main doors walked 60 feet of open stone floor before reaching the raised dais where the throne sat. 60 feet under ceiling vaults that soared 40 feet above, under banners bearing the Blackthorne crest in black and silver, under the weight of every king and queen who had ever occupied this kingdom. The room was built to make people feel small. Seraphina had never let it work on her. She walked those 60 feet the same way she'd walked every difficult thing. Straight-backed, chin parallel to the floor, eyes forward, pace steady. She stopped walking when she saw the crowd. The hall was full. Not full in the way it filled for ceremonies, packed with nobility and formal dress, arranged by rank and protocol. Full in a different way, cluttered with people, nobles standing in loose groups, murmuring, some of them still pulling robes over nightclothes, clearly summoned in the last hour. The pack lords were present. She could see them at the edges. The 6 territorial lords whose allegiance formed the structural skeleton of the kingdom, men who controlled land, armies, resources. All 6. At dawn. That was not an accident, and at the far end of the hall, on the dais, Darian. She took him in the way she'd always taken him in, first as a physical fact, then as an emotional one. He was built like something that had been designed by someone with no interest in mercy. Broad through the shoulder, tall in the way of men from the old bloodlines, with a jaw that could have been cut from the same stone as the palace walls. He wore no ceremony today. Simple dark wool, the Blackthorne signet on his right hand, no crown. She'd found early on that Darian without formal armor was Darian at his most dangerous. The trappings of office gave him somewhere to put the energy. Without them, it sat in him like a pressure behind the eyes. He was sitting in the throne with his forearms on his knees, leaning forward slightly, and even from 60 feet away she could read the particular quality of his stillness. She'd learned his stillnesses the way you learn the sounds a house makes before a storm, methodically, with survival in mind. This one was the stillness of a decision already made. Standing beside the throne, half a step behind and to the left, was the Lady Isolde Cavendry. Seraphina's stride didn't break. She gave no external indication that her stomach had just dropped clean to the floor. She covered the remaining distance, stopped at the base of the dais steps, and met Darian's eyes. "My lord," she said. "You're here." His voice was flat. Not cold. Darian's cold was different, quieter. This was something else, something with heat buried under pressure, like ground above a fault line. "I was summoned." "You were." He rose from the throne, and the room, which had been murmuring at the edges, went silent. The pack lords shifted. She caught Lord Brennan of the Western Marches watching her with an expression that wasn't hostility. It was something closer to pity. She filed that away. Pity meant he already knew what was coming. "Do you know why?" Darian asked. "I expect you're going to tell me." He came down the dais steps slowly, and she had learned, years ago, before the crown, that you did not back up when Darian moved toward you in this particular register. Backing up meant you were already conceding ground you hadn't surrendered yet. "Lady Cavendry has brought evidence to my attention," he said, "regarding your activities over the past several months." Isolde Cavendry, third daughter of the Cavendry house, elevated through a combination of political maneuvering and calculated proximity to power. Beautiful in the particular way of women who studied beauty as a discipline. She had spent 2 years positioning herself as an intimate of the palace's inner court, and Seraphina had watched the positioning without acting on it, because acting on it would have meant acknowledging the threat, and acknowledging the threat would have meant showing Darian that she felt threatened. She had calculated wrong. "What evidence?" Seraphina said. Not a question. A statement. She was buying 3 seconds to think. "Letters," Darian said. "Correspondence with Lord Edric Valmont of the Greyvale territories, dating back to before your coronation." The name landed in the room like a stone into still water. She watched the ripple move through the pack lords, through the assembled nobility. Edric Valmont was not simply a territorial lord. He was the primary financial backer of the separatist faction that had spent the last 4 years trying to fracture the kingdom's unified pack structure. The political cancer Darian had spent the entirety of his reign attempting to excise. To be connected to Valmont was not a matter of allegiance. It was treason. "You've seen these letters," she said. "I have." "And you believe they're mine?" Something crossed his face then. Something she couldn't read cleanly, which was rare, and it was gone before she could identify it. "The correspondence is in your hand, Seraphina." "Then show them to me." A beat of silence. She felt the room hold its breath. "Lady Cavendry," Darian said, and Isolde stepped forward from the shadow of the throne with a leather document case, the kind used by the palace records office, and extended it toward Seraphina. She took it. She opened it. She read. The handwriting was hers, or nearly hers, close enough to fool anyone who hadn't spent years living alongside the real thing. She'd written enough official correspondence that samples existed throughout the palace archives. She went through 3 pages before she found the first mistake, a single character she'd always formed differently, a habit from a writing tutor she'd had at 8 years old. The forger hadn't known to replicate that. Nobody in the palace would have known. She might have been the only person in the room who could identify it as a forgery. She closed the case. "These aren't mine," she said. "The scribes have verified the handwriting." The scribes verified a very good copy, Darian. She used his name directly. She watched him register it, watched something shift in the fault-line stillness. "Look at me. You've known me for 7 years. You have known me through the siege of Caldermere, through the Ashvale border crisis, through 3 assassination attempts on your own life where I was the first one to your side. You know my character. So I'm asking you to look at me directly and tell me whether you believe I'm capable of correspondence with Valmont." He looked at her. The room was so quiet she could hear torches. "The evidence is what it is," he said. It felt, she would think later, months later, in a log-walled room in the mountains with her body changed beyond recognition and the sound of wind instead of court ceremony. It felt like the floor had simply stopped being there. Not the sudden drop of catastrophe, the gradual recognition that the ground she had been standing on had never been as solid as she'd believed. "That's your answer," she said. "I need you to understand the position this places the kingdom in. The Pack Lords—" He stopped, started again. "If this evidence is made public and I take no action, it will appear that I've chosen personal attachment over the security of the realm. Valmont will use that. His faction will use it." "So this is about optics," she said. "This is about the survival of everything I've spent my entire reign building." Seraphina looked at Isolde Cavendry. Isolde held her gaze with the composed stillness of someone who had prepared for exactly this moment and was performing it correctly. There was no triumph visible in her expression. Isolde was too precise for visible triumph. But it was there underneath, the way heat was there in stone in summer. You couldn't see it, but you could feel it if you put your hand close enough. She looked back at Darian. "You've already decided," she said. He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "Then there's nothing left for me to say." She saw him hesitate. She saw, for just a fraction of a second, something that looked like a man standing at the edge of something he hadn't fully calculated. And then the king closed over the man again, the way water closes over a stone. "Luna Seraphina Vale," he said. His voice changed registers, became the one he used for formal pronouncements, the voice she had heard command armies and end lives. "By the authority of the Blackthorne throne and the consensus of the Pack Council, I hereby revoke your title and standing as Luna of this kingdom. You are stripped of all rank, access, and protection afforded by this house. You will be escorted from the capital before nightfall, and you are prohibited from entering the territory of Thornwall under penalty of execution." She stood very still. "Furthermore," he continued, and she could hear it costing him something. She wasn't sure yet whether that mattered. "Any association with your person by members of this court is hereby prohibited. Pack members who shelter or assist you will be considered in violation of Crown law." The 60 feet of floor between her and the doors seemed, in that moment, very long and very clear. She did not look at Isolde Cavendry again. She did not look at the Pack Lords, though she felt their eyes on her. She looked at Darian Blackthorne for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to let him see that she was not destroyed, long enough to let herself memorize the exact expression on his face at the precise moment he chose wrong. And then she turned, and she walked. All 60 feet. She did not hurry. She did not let her stride waver. She walked with her shoulders straight and her chin level and her hands still at her sides, and the sound of her footsteps on the stone floor was the only sound in the great hall of Thornwall Palace for the entire 60 feet. The doors opened before she reached them. Aldrich's men again, efficient to the last. She walked through them without pausing, and the heavy iron-strap doors swung closed behind her, and the sound of the latch catching was quiet and final, the quietest thing she'd ever heard. She was given 4 hours. Not by Darian. She didn't see him again before she left. By Aldrich, who delivered the timeline with the expressionless precision of a man carrying out orders he'd chosen not to weigh personally, and who also, she noticed this, cataloged it, slipped a sealed envelope under the door of her chambers when he believed she was in the adjoining room. She retrieved it. Inside was a single piece of paper, no signature, bearing 2 words in a hand she didn't recognize. Northern Roads. Someone in the palace believed she was worth 2 words. She tucked the note into the lining of her travel pack and didn't think about it again until she needed to. 4 hours was not much time. She used it the way she used every constrained resource, without waste. She did not pack the Luna's formal wardrobe. She did not pack the ceremonial pieces, the jeweled accessories accumulated over 4 years of representing the crown. She packed 3 sets of working clothes, the ones she'd kept in the back of her chest since arriving at the palace because she'd always known, somewhere in the bone-deep part of herself that didn't trust even good fortune, that she might need them. She packed her kit for field medicine. She'd trained for 3 years alongside the kingdom's war healers at Darian's own insistence, learning practical treatment for wounds and illness and the 1,000 ways the body failed under pressure. She packed the small personal items that mattered to her, which were few. A letter from her mother, dead these 12 years, a carved bone disc her training master in the Ashvale borderlands had given her when she'd earned her rank, a set of leather-bound maps of the northern and eastern territories that she'd spent 2 years annotating from official reports. There was one other thing she packed that she did not permit herself to think about directly. She had known for 3 weeks. She had been constructing the appropriate time and manner to tell Darian since the knowledge had settled into certainty, had been revising the approach in the quiet of early mornings while he slept, thinking about how to frame it, how to ensure he understood what it meant. She'd been careful with her timing because she'd understood in an abstract way that the information would change things between them, and she'd wanted to be certain of the ground beneath her feet before she altered it. The ground had turned out not to exist. She packed the small vial of wolfsbane and iron extract that the palace healer had prescribed her, and she packed it in the interior pocket closest to her body. And she did not think about what she was going to do with that information now, because thinking about it would cost her something she couldn't afford to spend. She left the palace through the servants' gate on the eastern side, accompanied by 2 guards who escorted her to the outer boundary of the capital and left her there without a word. The morning was gray and cold. She could smell rain coming from the north. She stood at the boundary marker, a carved stone post, Blackthorne crest weathered by decades, and looked back at the city for exactly as long as it took her to settle the pack straps correctly on her shoulders. Then she turned north because someone in the palace had thought it worth 2 words, and she was going to find out why. The Ashvale borderland girl who'd arrived at the capital 7 years ago had known how to move through wilderness. 4 years of palace living had softened the edges of that knowledge, but not the core of it, and within the first day of travel she found the core reasserting itself with the particular insistence of things that had been trained young. She moved off the main road by midday, tracking parallel to it through the tree cover, reading the landscape for shelter and water the way she'd been taught before she'd been taught anything about political protocol. The rain came in the afternoon, steady and cold, and she moved through it without slowing. She made camp that first night in the lee of a granite outcropping 8 miles north of the capital's outer boundary, in a hollow she'd chosen for 3 reasons: concealed approach, visible exits, dry ground. She built a fire small enough to give heat without giving light worth tracking. She ate from the provisions she'd packed with the same economy she applied to everything. Enough to maintain function, no more. She allowed herself, in the dark with the fire going, to sit with what had happened for exactly as long as it would take a coal to burn through to ash. Darian had looked at forged letters and chosen them over 7 years of her. Not over love, she had understood for some time that what existed between them was something more complicated and less warm than what stories called love, but over 7 years of demonstrated loyalty, of competence, of a pattern of behavior that should have constituted its own argument. He had looked at paper and chosen it over the living record. She had made an error, not in trusting him. She didn't regret the trusting, because the trusting had been based on evidence she'd gathered carefully, and she didn't second-guess good faith conclusions just because they'd turned out wrong. The error had been in failing to understand how completely the threat represented by Valmont's faction distorted his judgment. She had known he would choose the kingdom over anything personal. She had respected that about him. She had not understood that choosing the kingdom had come to mean choosing certainty over truth when truth required time he didn't believe he had. She could not fix his mistake. She could only manage what came next. The coal burned through. She banked the fire and went to sleep. By the fourth day, she had covered enough distance from the capital that the acute danger of pursuit had passed. Darian's prohibition was real. She didn't doubt that. But sending crown soldiers after an exiled Luna into the northern territories would create its own political complications, and Darian had enough complications. She moved less urgently and began paying attention to where she actually was. The northern territories above the capital were a different geography than the Ashvale borderlands of her childhood. Older forest, heavier, the trees thicker trunked and closer together, the undergrowth dense enough to require attention. She had studied the maps. She had annotated the reports about the settlements that existed up here, the frontier communities that operated at the edges of the kingdom's formal reach. What the official reports called informal settlements were, she knew from more practical intelligence, functioning communities that the Crown had chosen to classify as peripheral, rather than integrate into the formal pact structure. They existed outside Crown law, which right now meant they existed outside the prohibition that had been placed on assisting her. She followed the northern road until she reached the branch that the two-word note had indicated, and then she followed that branch east into territory that didn't appear on the official maps she'd brought, which meant the annotated intelligence she'd gathered was doing work the cartographers hadn't. She found the settlement on the sixth day. It was called, by the people who lived in it, Veldholm. It occupied a flat-bottom valley between two ridges of granite, sheltered from the prevailing wind, with a river running along the southern edge that provided water, and from the look of the mill wheel she could see from the ridgeline, power. There were 47 structures she could count from above, ranging from permanent log construction to the kind of heavy-framed canvas shelters that frontier communities used for expansion space. There was a central common area with a fire pit large enough for the whole community. There were fields on the eastern side, winter-prepared but clearly productive. The settlement had been here long enough to have permanent infrastructure. It wasn't a camp, it was a community. She came down from the ridge in the early afternoon, taking the approach that exposed her to the settlement's lookouts at the earliest possible point. She'd learned early that surprise was rarely advantageous when you were outnumbered and wanted shelter rather than combat. The lookout who intercepted her was a woman about Seraphina's age, broad through the shoulder, carrying a hunting bow with the particular ease of someone who used it as a matter of daily practicality rather than ceremony. "You're a long way from the road," the woman said. "I meant to be," Seraphina said. The woman looked her over with the frankness of someone who didn't have the time or inclination for politeness as a cover for assessment. "Carrying crown documents?" "Not anymore." A beat. "Name?" "Sarah." Her full name, on these roads, was a liability she couldn't afford. The shortened version was honest enough. The woman's eyes moved to the pack, to the traveling kit, to the way Seraphina had come down the ridge, the route she'd chosen, the speed she'd maintained. Whatever she was reading, it seemed to satisfy something. "I'm Marin," the woman said. "Come on then, we'll put you to work before we decide whether to keep you." Veldholm had approximately 200 people, which was larger than it appeared from the ridge. They did not ask many questions. They were, Seraphina came to understand in the first week, people who had their own reasons for existing outside the capital's formal reach, and those reasons had taught them the basic courtesy of not requiring others to enumerate theirs. What they asked instead was whether you could pull your weight, and she answered that question the way she'd always answered practical tests, by performing. She knew field medicine. In a frontier settlement with no formal healer, this was immediately and materially valuable. She knew the 3-month window of work she'd done with the kingdom's war healing corps, knew wound treatment and infection management, and the particular practical knowledge of keeping people functional under adverse conditions. By the end of the first week, she had a corner of the community's largest building designated as a treatment space and a line of people with winter ailments and agricultural injuries waiting outside it. She knew structural engineering in the sense that she'd spent 2 years reviewing the building reports for new construction in the palace's attached territories. It wasn't the same as the hands-on knowledge the builders of Veldholm had, but when the question arose of how to reinforce the mill structure against the spring floods, she could read the problem in engineering terms and contribute to the solution. She could hunt, could track, could move through the northern forest with enough competence to be genuinely useful to the parties that ranged out from Veldholm in search of winter game. She was not the best hunter in the settlement, but she was capable and reliable mattered more than brilliant in a frontier community. Marin, she discovered, was the settlement's effective leader, not by formal title, but by the particular combination of practical skill, sound judgment, and the willingness to be the person who made the hard calls that created functional authority regardless of what it was labeled. She was also, Seraphina learned in the third week, the person who had sent the two-word note. "You were in the capital?" Seraphina asked, on the evening she'd decided it was safe enough to ask. "My brother was," Marin said. They were sitting by the central fire, which was where Veldholm's informal councils happened. "He's in Aldrich's unit. Wrote to me when things started going sideways for you." She fed a branch into the fire. "Didn't know if you'd follow the note or not." "What made you send it?" Marin was quiet for a moment. "My brother said you were the only one in the Great Hall who walked out of it without showing them you were hurt." She poked the fire. "Figured someone like that was worth a road tip." Seraphina thought about the 60 feet of floor and the sound of the latch closing. "Thank you," she said. "Don't make me regret it," Marin said, and that was the end of the conversation. Winter deepened. The settlement pulled inward the way frontier communities did in the cold months, trading range for density. The 200 people of Veldholm occupying the same structures with the practical intimacy of people who had learned that warmth required sharing it. Seraphina adapted. She had grown up in the Ashvale borderlands where winter was not a season, but an opponent, and the adaptation came back to her body with the ease of things learned young. In the 5th week, alone in the small room she'd been given in the healer's building, she let herself think about the things she'd been not thinking about since the morning she'd packed her kit. She was 12 weeks along by the time she'd walked out of Thornwall. She was 17 weeks now, and she had kept herself busy enough and the changes were subtle enough, and frontier life was physical enough that nobody had yet connected what they might have seen. She had another 3 or 4 weeks before the question would start answering itself without her permission. She sat with it in the dark, in the same way she'd sat with the coal burning to ash on the first night, long enough to understand what she was looking at, not so long that she let it become something that made her less functional. Darian didn't know. She had been 3 weeks from telling him when Isolde Cavendry had moved and the window had closed. The question she was sitting with now was not whether to go back and tell him. That option had been sealed when he'd spoken his formal words in the Great Hall, and every pack lord in the kingdom had witnessed them. The question was what she was going to do next. She was going to do what she'd always done with every constraint and difficult resource she'd encountered. She was going to manage it. The child was Darian's heir, the unmistakable product of the royal bloodline, which would declare itself in its own time regardless of what anyone thought or planned. She could not prevent that. She could not change what the child would carry in its blood. What she could control was the context in which that child grew up, the values it was given, the understanding of the world it developed before the world started making its own claims on it. She was going to raise it here, in Veldholm. In the frontier where she'd come from, where people earned what they had and kept what they earned and didn't perform loyalty, they demonstrated it over time. She was going to raise it as Sarah's child before she let it be the crown's child. And she was going to survive everything between now and then because the alternative was not an option she was willing to consider. She was 26 years old. She was a banished Luna with no title, no protection, and no political allies beyond a frontier woman who'd sent her a 2-word note because her brother had reported that Seraphina hadn't shown them she was hurt. She was also the best prepared person she had ever known for exactly this situation. She went to sleep. The morning she told Marin it was snowing, the first real snow of the season, coming down in the thick vertical sheets that meant it would accumulate. They were in the healer's building, inventorying the winter medical supplies, and Seraphina decided, the way she decided most things that were going to be difficult, that direct was faster than gradual. "I'm carrying a child," she said. Marin didn't look up from the inventory list. "How far?" 19 weeks. "Whose is it?" Mine, Seraphina said. And then, because Marin had sent a note and that deserved the honest answer, the father is someone who doesn't know and won't be told. Marin finished her line on the inventory list. She set down the stylus. She looked at Seraphina with the expression she used when she was processing information she hadn't previously accounted for. That going to be a problem? She asked. The father? Is he someone who'll come looking? He'll have no reason to, Seraphina said. Marin picked up the stylus again. Then we'll need to expand the healer's space before spring. You'll need room. That was all. No further questions. No excavation of the story Seraphina hadn't told. Marin added a line to the inventory list, and they continued the count, and the snow came down outside and accumulated on the sill of the narrow window, and Seraphina thought that this was what trust looked like when it didn't dress itself up as something sentimental. The child made itself undeniable in the 6th month. Seraphina stood in the early morning beside the river, watching the ice edge forming at the banks, her breath in clouds in the cold air, and felt what she'd been told to feel for, what the healer text described with clinical precision. Movement. Small and unmistakable. She stood very still and let herself feel it fully for the first time. She had not permitted herself the full weight of it until this moment, had kept it in the category of things to manage, things to plan around, things to survive rather than things to experience. It was a survival strategy, and she didn't apologize for it. But standing by the river in the cold morning, she let it be real in its entirety. There was a person in her body, a person carrying the blood of 2 lineages, hers from the Ashvale borderlands, from the frontier that had built her into what she was, and Darian's, from the Blackthorne line that had ruled this kingdom for 6 generations. She thought about what that would mean. She thought about the timing of it, about the kingdom she'd walked away from and the political situation she'd left behind. She thought about what Darian would do if he ever knew. She thought, too, about the Pack Lord standing in that great hall, about Lord Brennan's expression, about the fact that the separatist faction Valmont led drew its power from the fractures in the unified pack structure, and a king with no confirmed heir was a fracture that faction could exploit with devastating effect. There was a piece of information that could change the shape of the kingdom. She was the only one who had it. She looked at the ice forming on the riverbank. She turned and walked back to Veldholm. Her son was born on the first warm morning of spring, when the snow had retreated to the high ridgelines and the river was running full and fast with snowmelt, and Marin was in the room, and 2 of the settlement's other women were in the room, and it was difficult in the way of all difficult things that your body had been building toward, sustained and painful and requiring everything you had, with nothing left over for anything else. He came into the world furious. That was the first thing. Not the cord, not the afterbirth, not the practical necessities Seraphina had memorized from the healer text. The first thing was that he was furious. Every feature of his small face arranged in the expression of someone who found his current circumstances unacceptable. She laughed. She hadn't expected to laugh, was surprised by her own body's response to him. But there was something in his expression that was so recognizably itself, so immediately and completely a self, that laughing was the only response that fit the situation. "He's going to be trouble," Marin said. "Yes," Seraphina said. She held him and felt the wolf blood in him, the subtle vibration of it, the inheritance that would declare itself in time. Darian's line, hers, both. She looked at his face, which was his own face, not yet assembled into a resemblance of anyone but already specific, already inarguably this particular person rather than any other. Rowan, she said. She had settled on the name in the 3rd month, had turned it over in her mind through winter without finding anything she liked better. Rowan, for the trees on the ridge she'd come down the day she found Veldholm. It was hers to give, and she gave it. She was 26 years old, banished, stateless, living in a frontier settlement under a name that was technically only half of hers, with an infant son carrying the blood of the most powerful throne in the kingdom, and she had never, in her adult life, felt as completely herself as she did in this moment. Outside the healer's building, the river ran fast in its banks, and the high ridgelines still held their snow, and somewhere, 300 miles south, a king was sitting with the weight of a mistake he didn't yet know the full dimensions of. She had survived the first part. She was going to survive all of it. She was 2 months into learning Rowan's sleep rhythms when Marin came through the healer's door at midnight, wearing the expression she wore when she had information that changed the shape of things. "We've got riders," Marin said. 6 of them, moving through the valley on the eastern approach. "They're not crown, wrong colors, wrong horses, but they're armed and they know what they're looking for." She paused. "They're asking about a woman and a newborn child." Seraphina was already on her feet, already lifting Rowan from the sleeping frame, already calculating. "How long until they reach the settlement?" 20 minutes, maybe less." 20 minutes. She ran the options with the efficiency of someone who had spent 4 years being responsible for Crown security decisions and had learned to think in compressed timelines. Not Crown soldiers, which meant Darian hadn't sent them. But someone had. Someone who knew she was carrying a child. Someone who had known that before she'd left the capital, before she'd even allowed herself to know it for certain. Only one person in the palace had been watching her closely enough, had had access to the right information, had possessed the motive and the resources to send 6 armed riders 300 miles into the northern territories within 2 months of the birth. Isolde Cavendry hadn't been finished when Seraphina walked out of the Great Hall. She was looking at a second move. "I need the eastern exit in the High Ridge path," Seraphina said, and her voice was steady, completely steady, and she held Rowan against her shoulder with one arm and reached for her pack with the other. And outside the narrow window of the healer's building, the spring night was very dark, and the riders were coming, and the first chapter of what she'd thought was over had just revealed itself to be something else entirely. The riders were moving fast through the eastern approach, and Seraphina had 20 minutes, which meant she had 15. She didn't waste 4 of them on fear. Rowan was against her shoulder, warm and dense with the particular gravity of new life, and she had her pack in one hand and her mind already running the High Ridge path. The elevation, the terrain, the places where a woman carrying an infant would lose time against 6 mounted riders who knew this valley better than she did. She ran the numbers and didn't like the output and adjusted. "The Kellner family," she said to Marin, "north end of the settlement. They have the root cellar under the barn floor." "I know it. If those riders reach the settlement before I'm clear of the ridge, that's where I'm not." She pulled the pack strap across her chest one-handed, settling Rowan's weight. "Tell them I was here 2 months ago and moved east toward Grayfen." Marin looked at her with the expression she used when she was accounting for a variable she hadn't planned for. "You sure you don't want to run?" "I'm sure I want options. Running is one. The cellar is another. I'll decide when I see where they stop." Ichi. She went out the back of the healer's building and into the spring dark, and the night air hit her, cold still, this high up, with the melt smell of the river cutting through everything. And she moved along the back wall of the building without letting herself hurry, because hurrying in darkness with an infant meant noise and stumbling, and both of those were worse than the 45 seconds she saved. Rowan made no sound. He was, she was beginning to understand, a child who observed before he announced himself, which was either instinct or inheritance, and either way, she was grateful for it tonight. She reached the edge of the settlement's northern boundary and went still in the shadow of the last storage building and listened. The night had its own sounds: the river, the wind off the high ridge, the particular creak of frontier structures settling in the cold. Under those sounds, at the edge of her range, she caught what she'd been listening for. Hoofbeats, not the random movement of horses in a paddock, purposeful, converging, eastern approach, which meant they were not yet between her and the ridge. She moved. The path up the ridge was one she'd been walking for months. First for the view, which told her things about the valley that ground level didn't, and then because Rowan seemed to settle in the motion of uphill movement when nothing else worked, and then because she'd understood sometime in the 4th month that she was mapping it the way she'd mapped every piece of ground she'd ever had to cross under pressure. Her feet found it in the dark without requiring her eyes. She was 2/3 of the way up when she heard the settlement wake below her. Not alarm, the people of Veldholm were too practiced for that. The low-controlled activity of a community managing an unexpected variable. She could see from the angle of the ridge the lights moving in the central area. She could see after a few minutes the shapes of horses at the settlement's main approach. 6 of them. Marin moving toward them from the fire, She stopped on the ridge and watched. At this distance, in this dark, she couldn't read faces. She could read postures. The riders were confident. Not the posture of men uncertain of their authority here, but the posture of men who'd been told they had backing that entitled them to certainty. The central rider, taller than the others, and mounted on a horse she could see was expensive even from the ridge, leaned forward over the pommel and said something to Marin. Marin's posture didn't change. Seraphina watched Marin's stillness with the particular recognition of someone who'd practiced the same thing. The way you held your body when someone with power was pressing you, when every instinct was to respond and the correct move was to give them nothing to push against. The conversation took 4 minutes. She timed it. At the end of those 4 minutes, the central rider straightened and said something to the men flanking him, and they began moving through the settlement. Not fast, not aggressive, but thorough. Checking buildings. The systematic search of people who were not afraid of being seen doing it. They were in Veldholm for 22 minutes. Then they reformed at the eastern edge and continued east, toward Grafen. She waited on the ridge until they were out of sound range. Then she sat down on a flat granite shelf and put her back against the rock and held Rowan, who had been awake through all of it, watching the darkness above them, with the unfocused intensity of an infant, not yet certain what darkness was. And she thought about Isolde Cavendry. 6 riders. Armed but not uniformed. Private, not crown. The kind of resource that required money, and the kind of connections that converted money into men without creating a record that would pass through official channels. That was not a noblewoman's personal guard detail. That was a woman with backers who wanted a specific outcome and were investing in it. The child. They had come for the child. Or rather, she corrected herself because precision mattered. They had come to confirm whether the child existed and where it was. A confirmation party, not a retrieval, which meant Isolde didn't yet have enough certainty to act directly. She was gathering information, which meant Seraphina had a window. She did not feel the fear until Rowan made a small sound and turned his head toward her chest, the seeking motion that meant he was hungry, and the ordinary domesticity of it. This entirely basic need, this small specific hunger that had nothing to do with politics or bloodlines or the power calculations of people 300 miles away, crashed through whatever had been holding the fear back, and she had about 30 seconds of sitting on a granite shelf in the dark, on a ridge above the settlement she might not be able to return to, holding her 2-month-old son and breathing through the particular sensation of understanding that someone was going to keep coming until they found what they wanted. 30 seconds. Then she was past it. She looked down at Rowan's face in the dark. The fury was gone. He was focused now, this patient intensity he deployed when he wanted something and was waiting to see if the world would provide it. She had noticed already that he did not escalate immediately. He started with the look. "I know," she said quietly. "Give me a minute." She was going to have to move. Not tonight, not in the dark with riders still in the valley, but soon. Veldholm had been shelter, and she was grateful for it in the precise, unsentimental way she was grateful for things that had kept her alive, completely, and without the expectation that gratitude required her to stay when staying was dangerous. Marin would understand that. It was possibly the thing about Marin she understood best. She went back down the ridge before dawn and found Marin in the central area, feeding the fire back to usefulness. "East," Marin said, without looking up. "I saw." "They'll be back when Grafen turns up nothing." She fed another branch in. "How long do you need?" 3 days to figure out where." Marin nodded. "You've got 4. After that I'll tell them you moved on last week." Seraphina sat across the fire from her and thought about the options with the same systematic method she'd used on every logistics problem the palace had ever put in front of her. North was too sparse. No community above Veldholm had the density to hide in, and single homestead living with a young child in the northern winter was a survival problem she wasn't confident she could manage alone. East had just been flagged. South was toward the capital, which was out. West was the mountain territories, the Veldris Range, which was technically kingdom land but practically ungoverned, where the settlements that existed did so because the terrain made them more trouble to administer than they were worth. West, deeper in, further from everything. "The Veldris communities," she said. Marin was quiet for a moment. That's hard country. I know hard country. With a child. He's going to have to learn it eventually, Seraphina said. I'd rather it was early. Marin looked at her across the fire, and whatever she was reading in Seraphina's face seemed to settle something. There's a settlement called Iron Hollow, about 60 miles in. They don't take newcomers easy, but they take people who prove useful. She paused. Tell them you were sent by Marin of Veldholm. It won't get you in. It'll get you a conversation. That's enough, Seraphina said. 300 miles south, in the palace at Thornwall, Darian Blackthorne had not slept properly in 4 months. He hadn't told anyone this. There was no one he would have told. The capacity for that particular vulnerability had been, he'd discovered since Seraphina's exile, one of the things she'd occupied. He'd been aware, in the 3 years he'd spent building toward her coronation, that she was useful to him in a range of practical ways. Her political acuity, her tactical understanding, her ability to read rooms and people with an accuracy that complemented his own different kind of reading. He had not been fully aware of the less catalogable ways she'd been useful, the way she'd asked questions that forced him to think past his first answer, the way her presence had functioned as a kind of pressure gauge on his own judgment. He was aware of it now. The inconsistency that started everything was small. A date. He'd been reviewing the evidence files in his private study, not because he'd had any intention of reopening what he'd considered a closed matter, but because the Valmont situation had escalated in ways that required him to understand its full architecture, which meant going back to the beginning. He'd been reading the correspondence attributed to Seraphina, comparing it to the intelligence reports on Valmont's movements, and a date didn't align. The letter dated to the 14th day of the 7th month cited information about a trade delegation that, per the intelligence record, hadn't been known outside the palace's restricted circle until the 19th. A 5-day gap. The letter shouldn't have been able to contain that information. He read it 3 more times. The gap remained. He told no one. He closed the file and sat for a long time in the dark of his study, with the fire going low and the date sitting in the middle of his thinking like a stone he kept walking around and always ending up next to. In the morning, he called for the palace archivist. He asked for Seraphina's official correspondence from the prior year, letters she'd written in her capacity as Luna, communication with the territorial lords, the formal documentation that had passed through official channels. The archivist produced it. Darian spent 2 days going through it. He was looking for the particular formation of a specific character, the 3rd letter of the alphabet in its lowercase form, which he had observed over 4 years of watching Seraphina write. She formed with a distinctive closure at the top that was almost but not quite a full loop. Consistent, habitual, not the kind of thing that varied. In the official correspondence, it was there in every instance. In the letters Lady Cavendry had presented as evidence, it wasn't. He sat with that for a long time. The person he would have told was Seraphina. He called for Captain Aldrich. Aldrich came to the private study and stood in the way he stood when he'd already accounted for the difficulty of what was coming. Darian didn't make him wait. I need to know where she is, he said. Aldrich's face performed a careful neutrality. My lord, the terms of the exile prohibition are terms I set and can adjust. I need to know where she is. I don't know where she is. Darian looked at him. Aldrich held the look for 3 seconds, which was longer than most men managed. I genuinely don't know her precise location, my lord. I can tell you that when she left the capital, she moved north. I can tell you that the tracking detail I assigned... He stopped. The tracking detail you assigned, Darian said, lost her trail at the 4th mile marker north of the capital boundary. She moved into tree cover and didn't come back to the road. Darian absorbed this. You assigned a tracking detail. As a precautionary measure, my lord, without authorization, yes, I was aware that was outside my orders. What made you think it was necessary? Aldrich was quiet for a moment. She had no guard, no official escort, no safe passage documentation, and she'd been publicly stripped of all crown protection. The northern territories in late winter present genuine survival risks. He paused. She shouldn't have been sent out alone. The statement landed in the room and neither of them addressed it directly. The trail went cold 4 miles out, Darian said. Yes, my lord. And you've heard nothing since? Aldrich's expression shifted by approximately 2 degrees, which on his face was the equivalent of significant visible change. I've received some communication suggesting she reached safety. I've received nothing specific. He met Darian's eyes. I made certain the communication channel was indirect enough that I couldn't testify to specifics. And you didn't bring this to me? No, my lord. Why not? Aldrich said nothing for a moment. Then, the night of the exile, my lord, the evidence against her was definitive, and she'd been given no opportunity to respond to it. I've served the Blackthorne line for 22 years. I know what the crown requires. I also knew, after 22 years, that I was watching something done wrong. He held his posture straight, not apologetic. I can't locate her for you. I don't have a location. But I also haven't done anything to help locate her for anyone else, and I won't. The last sentence was a position statement. Darian recognized it as such. There's someone looking for her? He said. The shift in Aldrich's face told him everything. He left the study and went directly to the records office, and from there to the intelligence archive, and he spent 3 days in it going backward through 4 months of correspondence, personnel records, travel documentation, and financial ledgers. It was meticulous, and it was exhausting, and it produced at the end of the 3rd day something that sat in his chest like a coal. Lady Isolde Cavendry had dispatched private riders north twice in the past 4 months. The first dispatch, 6 weeks after the exile, had returned. The second, 2 weeks ago, had not yet returned. The funding for both dispatches traced through 3 intermediate accounts to a financial house in the capital that also handled 2 investment accounts belonging to Lord Edric Valmont. He sat in the archive with that fact for long enough to understand its full shape. Isolde Cavendry was funded by Valmont. The evidence she'd produced against Seraphina had been funded by Valmont. Seraphina's exile, the political destabilization it had caused, the damage to the crown's unified image, the fracture it had created between the throne and the Western lords, who had respected the Luna's management of the border territories, had been funded by Valmont. He had been used, not fooled. He had made choices, had chosen certainty over inquiry, had looked at paper when he should have looked at the person who'd stood beside him for 7 years. But the architecture of it, the deliberate construction of a trap that had worked because it had correctly calculated how he would respond under pressure, that had been built with Valmont's money and Isolde Cavendry's precision. And Seraphina had walked 60 feet and out the door, and he hadn't stopped her. He called for Isolde Cavendry. He had a conversation with her that was, on its surface, entirely unremarkable. Social, brief, the routine interaction of a king and a court member. He watched her face the entire time. She was skilled. He'd have given her that even before he knew what he knew now. There was nothing visible in her expression that she hadn't put there on purpose. But he saw, at the end of the conversation as she rose to leave, just at the moment she believed the interaction was concluded and had allowed herself to relax by a fraction, he saw her glance toward the window that faced north. 2 seconds. Then it was gone. He placed her under discreet surveillance and began the search. It produced, over the following 6 weeks, nothing, which told him something too. Whoever had hidden Seraphina had done it in territory that didn't appear in Crown records, that didn't respond to Crown inquiries, that existed deliberately below the horizon of official documentation. She had gone somewhere that functioned outside his reach. The search was not quiet enough. He knew that, and he had weighed the risk before beginning it, and he had decided that the risk of not knowing outweighed the risk of Isolde understanding that something had changed. That calculation had been wrong. Isolde had understood something had changed within the first month, and she had moved her second rider party north before Darian had found the financial connection that explained her first. He stood at the window of his study on the morning he understood he was in a race he was currently losing, and he looked north, and the country between him and wherever Seraphina was felt like a physical weight. He had made the worst decision of his reign, possibly the worst decision of his life, based on manufactured evidence and the pride of a man who hadn't been willing to slow down long enough to look at what was in front of him. He'd known Seraphina for 7 years. He'd had 7 years of evidence about her character, her loyalty, her judgment. He'd discarded all of it in 60 seconds in a hall full of witnesses because a woman with Valmont's money had presented him with paper and he'd chosen the paper. There were things he could not undo. The words spoken in the Great Hall, witnessed by every pack lord in the kingdom, those could not be simply revoked. The legal and political structure of the exile prohibition was not something he could dissolve unilaterally without creating a constitutional crisis that Valmont's faction would exploit. He could not simply go get her, could not simply undo what he'd done. The machinery of the kingdom had too many observers for any of this to be quiet. What he could do was find her before Isolde's people did. What he could do was make certain she was safe, and make certain that what was coming, the trial, the exposure of Cavendry and her backers, the public accounting for a wrong that had been done in this throne's name, happened in the right order. He sent for his best tracker. Not a palace official, a man from the Eastern Territories who had found things before that shouldn't have been findable, who operated on retainer outside formal crown employment, who could move through the Northern Territories without his travel appearing in any record that Isolde's contacts might access. North, Darian told him. Frontier settlements. Someone who arrived in late winter and doesn't want to be found. He paused. Tread carefully. If she's found a place to be safe, I don't want to be the one who compromises that. The tracker looked at him for a moment, reading something in the instruction that Darian hadn't said directly. Yes, my lord, he said. Darian watched him go. He turned back to the window. North. What he was living with now was not grief exactly. Grief implied a conclusion. This was something that didn't have a conclusion yet, something he carried around the palace with him like a malfunction in the structural load-bearing, present in every room, unresolvable until the correct thing was done. He was a man who made decisions and lived with them. He had always believed that capacity was a strength. He understood now that it was only a strength if the decisions were made correctly, and that the confidence required to live with decisions quickly was the same confidence that had let him choose paper over a person in 60 seconds without looking back. He had been wrong about something he'd had every reason to know better about. That was not a political fact. It was a personal one, and it sat in him in a different place than political facts did. The tracker's first report came back in 3 weeks. A settlement called Veltholm, which didn't appear in official records. A healer woman who'd arrived in late winter, already gone by the time the report reached Darian, moved west into the Veldris mountain territory, taking her infant son with her. The words landed in his chest like a stone dropped from a great height. Infant son. He read the report 3 times. He sat very still. He thought about the timeline, late winter, 7 months after the exile. And he thought about what that meant, and he thought about how he hadn't known, couldn't have known, had been given no opportunity to know, because he'd made certain she had no reason to tell him. He read the report a 4th time. Then he put it in the fire, because no piece of paper with that information on it could be permitted to exist in any place where Isolde Cavendry's reach extended. He sat in the dark of his study for a long time. The tracker was already heading west. The Veldris settlements were rough country, heavy terrain, not easily navigated by someone unfamiliar with it. The report had given him one name, Iron Hollow. A settlement 60 miles into the mountains that didn't take newcomers easily. He stared into the fire and thought about Seraphina walking out of Thornwall's eastern servants' gate alone, with no guard and no safe passage, and no one behind her. And somewhere between the thought and its completion, something in him made a decision that was nothing like the 60-second certainty of the Great Hall. This was the slow kind, the kind that settled into the bones rather than the mind, that didn't require an audience, that didn't care about the complications it was going to create. He was going to find her. He was going to expose Cavendry and Valmont. He was going to do it in the right order so it held, so the kingdom couldn't fracture around it, so the trial was real, and the accounting was public, and the thing done wrong in his name was undone correctly. And then he was going to stand in front of Seraphina Vale with the full weight of what he'd done and offer her exactly nothing except the truth. Whether that was enough was not his calculation to make. He was still staring into the fire when Aldrich knocked. "My lord." Aldrich's voice through the door had its midnight information quality. "You need to see this." He rose and opened the door. Aldrich held a dispatch case, the unmarked kind, which meant frontier intelligence rather than official channels. He took it. He opened it. He read. The Veldris mountain territories were not, it turned out, as outside the kingdom's observational range as Seraphina had believed. The dispatch was from a Crown intelligence contact in the Western Territories, not Darian's contact, Aldrich's, which was how it had arrived through unofficial channels, and it contained a piece of information that reconfigured everything. Isolde Cavendry's second rider party had not gone east toward Grayfen and returned empty. They had gone east, turned, and were now in the Veldris foothills. 6 riders moving with specific directional intent toward a settlement that sat 60 miles into the mountains. They were 12 hours ahead of anyone Darian could dispatch. He looked at Aldrich. Aldrich's face was already past the calculation. "Horses are being saddled," he said. "I took the liberty." Darian was already moving toward the door. "My lord," Aldrich said, and something in his voice made Darian stop. "If we reach Iron Hollow first, what are we doing when we get there?" Darian looked at him. The question was a real one. A king arriving at an unofficial frontier settlement without authority documentation, outside the formal structure of Crown action, pursuing a woman he'd exiled under prohibition. The legal and political architecture of that situation was its own kind of minefield. "Whatever she needs," Darian said. He walked past Aldrich and down the corridor toward the stables, and behind him in the study the fire burned down to coals, and somewhere in the Veldris Mountains a woman who had survived everything he'd put her through was about to find out whether the thing she'd survived was finished or whether it was only changing shape. The Veldris Mountains did not care about human urgency. That was the first thing Darian understood when the horses began struggling at the 4th hour of the mountain approach. The grade too steep, the trail too narrow, the packed snow of late spring still holding the high paths in a grip that didn't negotiate with schedules. He and Aldrich had pushed hard from the capital, rotating horses at the relay posts, covering ground that should have taken 4 days and 2.5. They had gained back most of the 12 hours. But the mountains were a different calculation entirely, and the trail into the Veldris interior was not built for the speed of men with urgent reasons. He dismounted at the point where the trail became impassable on horseback and continued on foot, and Aldrich came behind him without being told. And the two of them moved through the mountain morning with the particular focused silence of men who had done difficult things together before and had learned that conversation was a resource you conserved. Iron Hollow, the intelligence report had said, 60 miles in. He was, by his best calculation, 43 miles in, and the settlement had not yet appeared. The trail crested a granite ridge and dropped into a valley, and he stopped. Below, smoke. 3 columns of it, rising from structures he could see now through the tree cover. Log construction, heavy framing, the infrastructure of a community that had been here long enough to build properly. A mill, a central common area, fields on the eastern slope, and he was counting now the way Aldrich had taught him to count settlements when he'd been 16 and learning the practical side of territorial management. 40, maybe 50 structures, large enough to have real internal organization. And below the settlement, on the western approach, 6 horses. He was looking at Isolde's riders from above, and they were already inside the settlement boundary. He moved. The path down the ridge was loose shale under thin snow, and he took it faster than was safe, because safe was not the current priority. Aldrich kept pace without commentary. They came off the ridge and into the tree cover at the settlement's northern edge, and Darian stopped to read the situation from cover before moving into the open. The 6 riders were in the central area. 3 of them mounted, 3 dismounted. A woman, heavy-set, broad-shouldered, the kind of physical presence that came from years of frontier work, was standing in front of the central fire facing the lead rider, and even from this distance her body language was the same body language Seraphina had used in the Great Hall, giving them nothing to push against. No sign of Seraphina, no sign of a child. Darian moved toward the settlement's edge, and a voice to his left said, "Stop there." He stopped. A man stepped out from behind a storage building, young, maybe 25, holding an axe with the casual grip of someone who used it for wood and wouldn't hesitate to use it for other things. Behind him, a second figure, older. "You're not with them," the older man said, looking past Darian toward the riders in the central area. "No," Darian said. "Then what are you?" He thought about the answer for exactly 1 second. "I'm looking for someone. Same as them. Different reasons." The 2 men looked at each other. Some communication passed between them that didn't require words, the shorthand of people who'd worked together long enough to develop it. Marin said there might be a second group, the younger one said. Marin, Darian said, is she the woman at the fire? She's the woman keeping those riders from doing what they came here to do, the older man said. She's been at it for 20 minutes. She can't hold it much longer. Where's the person they're looking for? Another look between the two men. The older one made a decision Darian could see happen in real time on his face. East Slope. There's a woodcutter's structure about a quarter-mile up. She went there this morning. Doesn't know they're here yet. Darian was already moving. He heard Aldrich behind him, heard the older man say something he didn't catch, and then he was through the settlement's eastern edge and into the tree cover on the slope, moving uphill through timber that was thick enough to require attention, following a path that was faint but visible if you knew to look, the compressed snow of regular foot traffic. He smelled smoke before he saw the structure. Small, low to the ground, built into the slope the way experienced frontier builders did it, using the hillside as insulation, conserving heat. He came around the last stand of trees and stopped. Seraphina was outside. She was splitting wood. That was the first thing, the practical fact of it. She was standing at a splitting block with an axe in her hands, wearing clothes that were worn at the knees and elbows, and her hair was pulled back in the kind of fast, functional way that meant she hadn't thought about it and didn't intend to. There was a child on a blanket on the flat ground to her left, surrounded by a low arrangement of stacked wood that blocked the wind and also, he registered, functioned as a barrier that gave her peripheral vision of anyone approaching. She did not stop splitting wood when he stepped into the clearing. Then she turned and saw him, and she did stop. The axe came to rest against her leg. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, and he had spent years learning to read her expressions, had thought he was proficient at it, and he understood now, standing at the edge of this clearing, that 4 years of proximity had not been enough, and the exile had added something to her face that he didn't have a category for yet. On the blanket, the child looked at him. Darian did the calculation that had been running since he'd read the tracker's report and confirmed it now. Approximately 5 months old. Sitting up against the wood barrier with the particular gravity of an infant who had been spending his developmental energy on observation. Dark-haired. The face still assembling itself into whatever it would be. He looked at the child and felt something shift in his chest that he did not have a word for. "Darian," Seraphina said. Not a greeting, not a question. Just the word, placed in the air between them like something she was deciding what to do with. "There are 6 riders at the bottom of your settlement," he said. "Isolde's. They're being held at the center by a woman named Marin, but that won't last. We have maybe 10 minutes. He watched her process this. He watched the shift happen, the personal registering and being set aside in one breath, replaced by the operational. She looked at the child, then back at him. "You came alone?" "Aldrich is below, 2 of us. Against 6. Plus whatever the settlement can put together." He held her eyes. "Seraphina, we need to move." Something crossed her face, complicated and fast, the face of someone doing simultaneous calculations in different registers. Then she bent and picked up the child with the practiced motion of someone who had been doing it for months, settling him against her left side so her right hand stayed free, and she looked at Darian with an expression that had clarified into something much simpler. "Follow me," she said. She took him up the slope, not down. He understood the logic. High ground, visibility, a defensible position above the settlement that gave them information before requiring commitment. She moved fast for a woman carrying a child, and she didn't need to check that he was keeping pace, which told him she'd already categorized him as someone who could hold her speed. That was a form of information, too. She stopped at a granite outcropping that gave them a sightline down into the settlement's central area. Below, the situation had changed. 2 of the riders had dismounted and were moving toward the eastern edge of the settlement, moving toward the slope. Marin was still at the fire, but the lead rider had stepped around her, and the particular geometry of the scene told Darian that the next 60 seconds were going to require a decision. "How many in your settlement can fight?" he asked. 8, maybe 10 who'll actually do it. She was watching below. The rest will get out of the way, which is also useful. "Aldrich has a commission in the Crown Cavalry. He can take 2 of them alone if the terrain is right. The terrain isn't right down there. She was quiet for a moment, the child against her side, her eyes moving through the scene below with the same systematic attention she'd used to move through political situations in the palace. The lead rider. He's the one with direct orders. The others are hired. You know him? I know the type. Hired men with a specific contracted objective don't escalate past the objective if the objective becomes too costly. The lead rider is the problem. She looked at Darian. What authority do you have out here? Practically. Not theoretically. The question landed squarely. Practically, I have Aldrich and the Blackthorne signet. The prohibition I set is still legally in effect, which means I have no official standing to protect you. You understand how that sounds? I do. He held her gaze. I'm here anyway. The thing that happened in her face when he said that was not forgiveness. He wasn't looking for that, and she wasn't offering it. It was something narrower and more functional. A recalculation. Then here's what we're going to do, she said. She was already moving before she finished the sentence. What happened in the next 8 minutes in the settlement of Iron Hollow was the kind of thing that didn't appear in official reports, because there was no official structure in which to report it. Seraphina handed Rowan to the older man from the northern edge with a set of instructions delivered in a tone that made instruction sound like simple fact. And then she came back into the settlement's central area from the east, while Darian came in from the north and Aldrich moved from the west with the quiet precision of someone who had been doing this for 22 years. The lead rider saw Seraphina first. He was already moving toward her, and she walked toward him with the same straight back and level chin that had covered 60 feet of palace floor, and the morning light was cold and clear, and she stopped 10 feet from him and waited. You've been difficult to find, the rider said. I wasn't hiding, she said. I was living. Lady Cavendry requires... Lady Cavendry, Seraphina said, and her voice had an edge in it that Darian recognized, the edge she used when she was done managing the surface of a conversation. Has no authority over me. She never did. Whatever she told you she requires from me, she obtained by fraud, and the man who can confirm that is standing behind you. The rider turned. Darian stepped into the open. The change in the rider's face was the change of a man recalculating a contracted risk in real time. The Blackthorne signet on Darian's right hand was visible. Aldrich had positioned himself at the western edge with an economy of placement that communicated exactly what it was intended to communicate. 3 of the hired riders had already shifted their horses, the instinct of men whose contracts did not include standing against the crown. The lead rider looked at Darian. My lord, he said. The honorific came out flat, neither respectful nor hostile, the tone of a man buying time. Your employer is currently under investigation by the crown, Darian said. He made his voice the formal register, the one that filled rooms. The contract you're operating under was issued in connection with activities that constitute treason against the Blackthorne throne. Any action you take in execution of that contract constitutes participation in that treason. He paused. Or you can turn your horses around. 4 of the 6 hired men turned their horses around within the next 30 seconds. The lead rider looked at Seraphina. She looked back at him with nothing in her face that he could use. He turned his horse. The sound of the hooves going back down the western trail was very clear in the mountain morning. Darian watched until they were out of sight. The settlement had gathered at the edges, the people of Iron Hollow watching with the careful attention of people who had learned to observe power dynamics as a survival skill. He turned to Seraphina. She was looking at him with the expression he'd been unable to categorize when he'd stepped into the clearing. He could place it now. It was the expression of someone who had prepared for every version of this moment except the one that had actually happened and was now recalibrating. The child, Darian said. His voice came out different than he'd intended, quieter. The report said a son. Yes. He's mine. It wasn't a question. The blood declared itself clearly to anyone who knew what to look for, and he had 7 years of knowing Seraphina to tell him the rest. Yes, she said. He breathed. You were going to tell me. I was. The flatness in her voice when she said it was not hostility. It was the flatness of simple fact. Before Cavendry moved, I was 3 weeks from telling you. He had no response to that was adequate, so he said nothing. The older man came back from the northern edge of the settlement with Rowan. He handed the child to Seraphina with a nod that contained its own kind of communication. The nod of someone who had decided this situation was above his particular jurisdiction and was returning the variable to its origin point. Seraphina settled Rowan against her side and looked at Darian. The child looked at Darian. He had the eyes. Darian felt it land in his chest again, that wordless shift. The Blackthorne eyes, the particular gray of them that had been consistent through 6 generations of the line. Looking at him from his son's face, from the arms of a woman he'd exiled on forged evidence while she was carrying that son and hadn't known, and the full weight of what he'd done assembled itself in his chest with a completeness he hadn't permitted it to reach until this moment. "What's his name?" Darian said. "Rowan." He looked at her. "Can I—" "Not yet," she said. Quiet. Not cruel, just exact. He nodded. Aldrich appeared at his shoulder, and Darian registered something different in Aldrich's posture, not the controlled calm of the morning's action, something tighter. "My lord," Aldrich said. "The rider who left, the lead one. What about him?" "He's not going back to Cavendry empty-handed." Aldrich's voice was low, for Darian only. "He saw the child. He saw you here. That information is worth more to Cavendry than a retrieval would have been." Darian understood immediately. If Isolde knew the heir existed and knew that Darian had come north personally to find Seraphina, she had something far more powerful than a simple exile. She had leverage, the kind that could be used to fracture the pack lords who had been wavering, to fuel Valmont's separatist narrative, to create a constitutional crisis around the question of an unacknowledged heir born outside the formal structure of the crown. He had ridden here in urgency, and the urgency had been real, but the action had been exposed, and now the exposure was riding back down the mountain to deliver itself to a woman who knew exactly what to do with it. "How much time?" he said. Aldrich calculated. "Cavendry gets the information in 4 days if the rider pushes hard. She acts on it within 48 hours of that. 6 days, my lord. Maybe 5. 6 days. He looked at Seraphina. She had heard. He could see from her face that she'd heard, and she was already running the same calculation. "You need to come back," he said. "Not for me. For the legal structure. An heir of the bloodline recognized formally, with Cavendry and Valmont exposed at the same time, that closes the window she's going to try to open." Seraphina looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked down at Rowan, who was watching a bird in the tree above them with the concentrated attention of a person encountering a new category of thing. "And if I don't want to come back," she said, "then I'll fight this from the capital alone, and it will be messier and take longer, and Cavendry will use the time." He held her eyes. "But I'm not ordering you. I'm done with orders that override your right to decide." It cost him something to say it. He let it cost him. He was starting to understand that the things that cost him something were the ones that mattered. She was quiet for long enough that a bird called twice in the trees above them. Rowan tracked the sound. Seraphina watched her son track it. "I need 3 days," she said finally, "to settle things here, to explain to the people who took me in what's happening, to decide what I'm deciding." "I'll be at the Eastern Waypost at dawn on the 4th day," Darian said. "If I'm not there," she said, "don't come back." Understood. He held her gaze for 1 more second, long enough to let her see that he was carrying the full weight of what he'd broken, that he wasn't diminishing it into something that could be resolved quickly, that he understood the difference between regret and accountability and was not confusing one for the other. Then he turned and walked back toward the northern trail. He was 10 paces out of the central area when her voice came. "Darian!" He stopped, didn't turn immediately. "He has your jaw," she said. "Thought you should know." He stood still for 1 breath. Then he continued walking. Behind him, in the settlement of Iron Hollow, with the smoke rising from the structures in the cold mountain morning, and the western trail empty now, where 6 horses had gone, and the birds still calling somewhere in the timber, Seraphina Vale held her son, and looked north at the granite ridgeline, and felt the full terrible complexity of what was coming arrange itself around her like weather. Not the disaster she'd survived, something harder than that. The disaster she'd survived had been about endurance. What was coming was about choice. The deliberate, eyes-open, no-illusions choice of a woman who understood exactly what the world she was walking back into looked like, and was choosing it anyway because the alternative was to let the wrong people win, and that was one thing she had never in her life been able to make herself do. She looked down at Rowan. He looked back at her with gray eyes that were, in the right light, unmistakable. "All right," she said quietly. To him, to the mountain, to herself. "Let's go finish this." Below the settlement, on the western trail, the lead rider pushed his horse hard toward the lowlands, carrying in his head a piece of information that was about to change the shape of an entire kingdom. And in the capital 300 miles away, a woman with Valmont's money and a forger's patience sat in her palace rooms and waited for the news she'd sent 6 men to retrieve, not yet knowing that what was riding back toward her was not the outcome she'd planned for, but the beginning of her own undoing. She was at the eastern waypost before dawn. Darian was already there. Neither of them commented on the fact that they'd both arrived early. Seraphina came out of the tree cover with Rowan against her chest in the carrier wrap Marin had made for her, pack on her back, and she stopped at the edge of the clearing where Darian stood beside 2 horses with Aldrich a few paces behind, and they looked at each other in the pre-dawn dark with the directness of people who had run out of the kind of time that permitted indirection. "The pack lords," she said. "What's their position?" "Brennan and Hartwell are holding. The other 4 are watching which way the wind blows." He handed her a horse's reins. "Cavendry has been moving since the rider returned. She's called in debts. There's a council session in 6 days." "What's the session for?" "She's petitioning to have Rowan declared illegitimate on the grounds that he was born outside the formal recognition structure during a period of active exile prohibition." His voice was flat, delivering intelligence. "If the council votes to sustain the petition, it closes the heir question legally and permanently." Seraphina mounted with Rowan secured against her, the motion practiced enough by now that it didn't require thought. She looked down at Darian from the horse. "She's faster than I gave her credit for," she said. "She had this prepared before she sent the riders north," Darian said. "The petition was already drafted. She was waiting for confirmation that the child existed." Seraphina absorbed this. The cold of the pre-dawn was sharp in her lungs, and Rowan was warm against her chest, and she thought about a woman in a palace room with a drafted petition and 6 hired riders and Valmont's money, sitting very still and waiting for confirmation, and she felt something that wasn't quite fury. Fury was too hot, too fast, something colder and more durable than fury. "Then we ride," she said. They rode. 3 days of hard travel through the lowland territories, pushing the horses to the edge of what the terrain allowed, camping in 4-hour stretches that barely qualified as rest. Aldrich managed the logistics, water, feed, route selection, with the economy of a man who understood that every unnecessary minute was a minute Cavendry was using. Darian rode without complaint through conditions that the palace life of the last several years had not been keeping him in shape for, and Seraphina watched him suffer through the second day's mountain-to-lowland descent without showing it, and revised something in her assessment of him. She had known him as a king. She was watching him now as a man making himself useful in the particular unglamorous way of difficult travel, and the 2 things were not entirely the same. On the second night, camped in the lee of a river embankment with the fire going low, Rowan fed and asleep in the carrier, Darian sat across from her and said without preamble, "I went through the financial records. The connection to Valmont is documentable through 3 intermediary accounts. Cavendry's role in commissioning the forgery is provable through the forger. I have him. He's under Crown custody." "You arrested the forger." 3 months ago. I've been building the case since." He looked at the fire. "I wanted it complete before I moved against her. A partial case gives her room to work in." "The council session is in 3 days now," she said. "I know. A case that's still being built doesn't help in 3 days. I know that too." He met her eyes. "What I have is enough for a public challenge, enough to force the council to delay the petition vote pending investigation. It's not a trial yet, but it's enough to buy time." "And Valmont?" Valmont is the long game, Cavendry is the immediate problem. He paused. The Separatist faction has been using the instability, the exile, the Heir question, the Pack Lord's uncertainty, as fuel. If Cavendry's petition succeeds, they have a constitutional argument that the throne is operating without a legitimate succession. That's the real weapon. Seraphina looked at the fire and thought about architecture. The way Cavendry had built this, layer on layer, each piece functioning to support the next. The forged letters had created the exile. The exile had created the Heir question. The Heir question, improperly resolved, created constitutional uncertainty. Constitutional uncertainty fractured the Pack Lords. Fractured Pack Lords couldn't sustain the unified structure that kept Valmont's separatist faction from becoming a real power. It was, she acknowledged with the cold part of her mind that assessed things regardless of what she felt about them, sophisticated work. She built this over years, Seraphina said. Yes. Before she even approached you with the letters, the financial connection to Valmont goes back further than the forged correspondence. Darian was quiet for a moment. 2 years before, she was Valmont's asset inside the court before she was a problem for you specifically. Seraphina looked at him. You knew about the 2 years. I found it in the records. And you didn't know she was there. No. He said it without softening it. I didn't know. I should have. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the fire. Rowan made a small sound in his sleep, the sound he made when he was transitioning between sleep cycles, and stilled again. He does that every 40 minutes, she said. Darian looked at the child. Something moved in his face. Does he sleep well otherwise? Better than I did at his age, apparently. My mother told me I screamed for the first 3 months. She paused. He watches things. He's been doing it since he was 2 weeks old. Just watching. Darian was quiet for a moment. Then, he has your way of going still when he's thinking. She looked at him. He was looking at Rowan with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before, and she understood that she was watching a man encounter, under constraint, something he would have needed time to encounter correctly if time had been available. Get some sleep, she said. We need 4 hours a minimum. She watched him settle across the fire without further conversation, and she sat watch with Rowan against her chest, and the river ran low and fast in the dark, and she thought about the next 3 days with the same systematic method she'd used on every difficult thing in her life. Not suppressing the difficulty, but mapping it, finding its edges, identifying what was within her control and what was not. What was within her control was her own conduct when they reached the capital. What she presented to the council, how she presented it, the impression she made walking back into that building after 14 months of exile. She had been a frontier woman before she'd been a Luna, and she would be both now. She had walked 60 feet out of that hall. She was going to walk 60 feet back in. She did not sleep. They reached the outer boundary of the capital on the morning of the 5th day since Iron Hollow. Darian had sent a rider ahead with a sealed communication for Aldrich's network inside the palace, the secondary communication structure that Aldrich had apparently been maintaining for years without Darian's knowledge, which was its own kind of information about Aldrich's estimation of how things could go. By the time they reached the city gates, there was a small escort waiting. Not crown soldiers, which would have created the wrong visual, but 4 men Darian trusted, with horses and the kind of quiet efficiency that moved people through crowds without drawing attention. They entered the city. Seraphina kept her hood up, not from fear, but from strategy. The capital would know she was back soon enough, and the order in which information spread mattered. The council session was tomorrow. She wanted to be inside the palace structure before the street information reached Cavendry's contacts. She was not fast enough. The message reached her in the palace's private guest quarters, delivered by a young runner who clearly didn't know what he was carrying, a folded piece of paper, no seal, 3 sentences in handwriting she recognized from the forged letters. Not Cavendry's own hand, too careful for that, but someone writing on her direction. The message said, "The council session has been moved to tonight. The petition has been amended to include a clause of criminal endangerment against the former Luna for concealing the existence of an heir during a period of exile prohibition. If the former Luna appears before the council, she appears as a defendant." Seraphina read it twice. She put it down on the table. She stood in the center of the room with Rowan on her hip and the particular quality of stillness that happened when the geometry of a situation changed faster than the plan had accounted for. Cavendry had known they were in the city. Someone at the gate, or someone watching the roads, or someone in Aldrich's network who wasn't only in Aldrich's network. It didn't matter which. The result was the same. The session moved, the terms changed, and the legal framework she'd just been placed in converted her presence before the council from testimony into liability. Criminal endangerment. 14 months in frontier territory with an infant son she'd been protecting from the woman who was now accusing her of concealment. She understood, with the cold clarity of someone who had lived at the intersection of legal language and political intent, that the charge didn't need to be true to function. It needed to be plausible for long enough to get a council vote. She was still standing in the center of the room when Darian came through the door. He had the same paper in his hand. He read her face and skipped the preamble. "She's moved the timeline," he said. "I see that. The criminal clause is designed to prevent you from speaking in your own defense without self-incrimination. She's built a catch." He set the paper down with a precise, controlled motion. "If you appear, you're a defendant. If you don't appear, the petition passes by default." "There's a third option," Seraphina said. He looked at her. "You surrender your authority to the council before the session opens," she said. "Formally, on the record. Before she can use the session to act, you remove yourself as the authorizing structure for the exile prohibition. Without the prohibition, there's no legal framework for the criminal clause. The charge depends on the exile being valid. If you publicly acknowledge the exile was made on fraudulent evidence..." She stopped. "It invalidates everything downstream," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "It also opens me to formal censure from the council for misuse of crown authority." "Yes." He held her eyes. She didn't soften it. He'd asked for the truth, and the truth included the parts that cost him something. "All right," he said. She had not expected it to be that fast. She'd prepared for more conversation. He saw that in her face. "I told you in the mountains," he said. "I'm done making decisions that override your right to decide. That includes decisions about whether I'm willing to take a political consequence to correct something I did wrong." He picked up the message paper and put it in his coat. "I'm going to need an hour with the council's chief recorder before the session opens. Aldrich has a contact. Can you keep Rowan settled?" "I can keep Rowan settled," she said. He moved toward the door. She said his name and he stopped. "If this works," she said, "the censure is still real. The council has grounds." "I know." "They may use it." "That's their right." His voice was even. "I used my authority badly. There are supposed to be consequences for that. If there weren't, the system would be worth less than it costs to maintain." He looked at her for one more beat. "I should have said that to the full council a long time ago." He left. She stood in the room with Rowan and the late afternoon light coming through the narrow window, and she thought about a king walking into a council chamber to surrender his authority before his enemy could use it, and she thought about the distance between what she'd believed he was capable of 14 months ago and what she was watching him do now, and she didn't let herself resolve that distance into anything simple because it wasn't simple, and she wasn't in the business of simplifying things that weren't. The session convened at dusk in the council hall, a room she knew well, smaller than the Great Hall, built for deliberation rather than display. The six-pack lords were present. The council's legal structure was present. Isolde Cavendry sat on the petitioner's side with two legal advisors, composed and precise, wearing an expression that had calculated this evening's outcome and found it acceptable. She did not show surprise when Seraphina walked in. Seraphina had expected that. Cavendry was past the stage of showing surprise, but something moved in her eyes, quickly, suppressed immediately, that told Seraphina the specific version of this entrance had not been the version she'd planned for. Darian was already at the council floor. He stood without ceremony, the Blackthorne signet visible, and when the council's senior lord opened the session, Darian spoke before the petition could be formally introduced. "I have a prior matter for the record," he said. The senior lord, Lord Brennan, whose face had worn pity in the Great Hall 14 months ago, and now wore something more carefully neutral, inclined his head. "The floor recognizes the Alpha King. I am submitting, for formal inclusion in the council record, a statement of acknowledgement. His voice was the formal register, controlled and carrying. The exile prohibition issued against Seraphina Vale 14 months ago was enacted on the basis of evidence I have subsequently determined to be fraudulent. The evidence was forged and presented to me through deliberate deception by parties whose interests were opposed to this throne. I acted in haste and without adequate inquiry, and in doing so, I exercised crown authority incorrectly. He paused. I am formally acknowledging this error before this council and submitting myself to appropriate censure. The exile prohibition is hereby revoked with full retroactive recognition of its invalidity. The council hall was very quiet. Isolde Cavendry's composure had not broken, but her lead legal advisor had leaned toward her and was speaking quietly, rapidly, and the speed of his speech was the speed of someone recalculating in real time. Lord Brennan looked at Seraphina. Luna Vale. She stepped forward. My lord, are you prepared to speak to the council on the matter of the petition? I am. What happened in the next 2 hours was not the dramatic confrontation the room might have been built to expect. It was methodical. It was procedural. It was the careful, systematic presentation of evidence that Darian had spent 14 months assembling. The financial records, the forger's testimony delivered by Aldrich in formal deposition, the date discrepancy in the correspondence, the 2-year history of Cavendry's connection to Valmont's financing. It was Seraphina answering the council's questions with the directness of someone who had nothing to hide and the precision of someone who had spent 4 years in the highest levels of political administration and knew exactly how a council's evidentiary standards worked. Isolde Cavendry's legal advisors challenged at every point. They were skilled. The challenge on the financial records was particularly sharp. 3 intermediary accounts created genuine interpretive ambiguity about Cavendry's direct knowledge versus structural proximity. Seraphina watched the council's faces during the financial challenge and saw 2 of the wavering lords begin to recalculate. She stood. She had not planned to speak again at that point. It was not yet her moment in the formal structure. But she stood and Brennan allowed it, and she looked at the council. The petition before you claims I concealed the existence of an heir, she said. I want to address that directly. I left the capital 14 months ago without crown protection, without safe passage, without a single official resource, under a prohibition that prevented any pack member from assisting me. I was carrying a child whose bloodline, if known, would have made both of us a target for the people who had already demonstrated they were willing to use fraud against the crown. I did not conceal the heir from the throne. I protected the heir from the people who had successfully deceived the throne once and were positioned to do so again. She let that sit for one breath. If this council wishes to call that criminal, it should also be prepared to answer why the crown provided no mechanism by which an innocent woman could have safely done anything else. The room was silent. Lord Brennan looked at Cavendry. Cavendry met his gaze with composure. But the 2 advisors had stopped writing, which told Seraphina something more useful than Cavendry's face did. Brennan looked back at the council. We'll recess for deliberation, he said. The recess took 40 minutes. Seraphina stood outside the chamber with Darian on one side and Aldrich on the other and Rowan in her arms, and she did not speak, and neither did they. And the silence between the 3 of them was the silence of people who had each done what they could do and were now waiting for something outside their control. Rowan grabbed her collar with his fist and held on. When the chamber doors opened, Brennan's face told her the answer before he spoke it. The petition is dismissed, he said. The council has voted to open a formal investigation into the conduct of Lady Isolde Cavendry and her financial connections to Lord Edric Valmont. Lady Cavendry is to be confined to her palace residence pending the investigation's completion. He looked at Darian. The council also formally acknowledges the Alpha King statement and will conduct a separate review of the exile prohibition's issuance. That review will take 90 days. He looked at Seraphina. Luna Vale, the council recognizes your status as reinstated pending the formal review. You are entitled to all protections and rights of that standing effective immediately. Cavendry rose from the petitioner's seat. Her composure held. Seraphina gave her that, held to the last. She looked at Seraphina once, a look that contained an entire renegotiation of the future she'd constructed, and then she looked away and let the council's appointed officers escort her from the hall. The chamber doors closed. Seraphina stood in the hall that had been built to overwhelm and held her son, and felt the silence of it differently than she'd felt silence in this palace before. Not the held silence of a crowd waiting for something, not the final silence of a latch catching. This was the silence after something had broken and the breaking was finished. She felt Darian at her shoulder. Not close, not presuming, just present. The investigation, she said. Valmont. 30 days to build the full case, he said. Maybe 25 if the financial investigators move fast. And the rebels using his funding. The eastern border engagement is still active. 3 territorial crossings in the last 2 weeks, he paused. That's the next problem. She looked at the closed chamber doors. She thought about 25 days, 30, the active border crossings, the rebel faction that had been fueled by 14 months of constitutional instability, the pack lords who were still watching which way the wind blew. You need the pack united, she said. I need the pack united, he confirmed. And the border secured and Valmont's network dismantled, and the council review concluded without a censure that the separatist faction can use as political leverage. He paused. In roughly that order. She turned and looked at him. He looked back at her with the face of a man who was not asking for anything and knew it, and had decided that knowing it was the honest position. One thing at a time, she said. Yes. The border first. The border first. She looked down at Rowan, who had released her collar and was looking at Darian with the concentrated observation he deployed when he was deciding something about a new piece of the world. He wants to know what you are, she said. Darian looked at Rowan. Something in his face shifted. Not the controlled shift of a man managing his expression, but the unmanaged kind, the kind that happened when the body responded before the mind had finished its instructions. I'm not sure I know how to answer that yet, he said quietly. No, she said, but you'll have to figure it out. She walked past him toward the chamber exit and the night beyond it, and outside the council hall of Thornwall Palace, the capital was moving in its ordinary evening rhythms, entirely unaware that in the next 30 days everything was going to be required of the people who had just walked out of that room. Every resource, every alliance, every hard lesson of the 14 months that had broken this family apart and the 7 years before that had built it, because Valmont's forces were already moving on the eastern border, and the information reaching Aldrich's network in the final hours before the session had been specific and ugly. 1,200 fighters, 3 territorial breach points, a coordinated action designed to exploit the constitutional moment before it closed. The window was not closed yet, and in the east, someone had decided to come through it. The eastern border did not wait for anyone to be ready. The first breach report reached Aldrich's network at midnight, 2 hours after the council session closed. 300 fighters crossing the Veldris lowland passage, under cover of dark, moving fast, and without the supply trains that indicated a sustained campaign. This was not an occupation force. This was a precision strike, designed to reach the capital's outer territories before the Crown could organize a response, designed to create visible instability on the ground that Valmont's political faction could point to as evidence of a throne that could not hold its own borders. Darian had the deployment orders written before the second report arrived. Seraphina read them over his shoulder in the war room, Rowan asleep in the adjoining chamber under Aldrich's watch, and she made 3 changes to the deployment structure without asking permission. Adjusted the western flank assignment to account for the terrain she knew from the Veldris approach, shifted the reserve position to a ridgeline that the original orders had placed in the low ground for logistical convenience rather than tactical advantage, and added a communication relay station at the 4th mile marker that would cut the information delay between the forward units and the command position by 40 minutes. Darian looked at the changes. He did not ask why she'd made them. He incorporated them and sent the revised orders. She noted that, filed it. The campaign lasted 11 days. She did not fight on the line. Rowan was 5 months old, and that was not a calculation she was willing to make. And she did not pretend otherwise, or dress it in language that made it sound like anything except what it was. She worked the command position. She processed the incoming intelligence with the systematic attention she'd been trained for, identified the patterns in Valmont's tactical choices that revealed his strategic assumptions, and brought those patterns to Darian in the compressed, functional language of a command briefing. On the 4th day, she identified the assumption that broke the campaign open. Valmont's force structure was built on the premise that the Pack Lord's uncertainty would prevent coordinated territorial response, that the wavering lords would hold their forces back and wait for the constitutional question to resolve before committing. It was a reasonable assumption based on 14 months of evidence. It was wrong because the council session had changed the variable that assumption depended on. She brought it to Darian at 3 in the morning, the map spread on the field table, and she showed him the gap in Valmont's eastern deployment that would only exist if he believed the western lords weren't coming. "He doesn't know Brennan committed," she said. Darian looked at the map. "The western corridor. If Brennan moves tonight, before Valmont's scouts can report back, the eastern force is flanked before dawn." She paused. "It ends it. Not contain, ends it." He looked at her across the map in the lamplight of the command tent, and she could see him running the same calculation she'd run, checking her work the way she would have checked his. "Get Brennan," he said. She got Brennan. The Western Corridor maneuver took 4 hours and cost them 11 fighters, which was 11 more than she would have wanted and 11 fewer than it would have cost to let the campaign extend another week. Valmont's eastern force collapsed under the flanking pressure before sunrise on the 5th day. The remaining fighters surrendered or scattered into the lowland forest. The 3 breach points were sealed by the 7th day. By the 11th, the border was quiet. Valmont himself was taken on the 9th day, not in combat. He had not been with his forces, which had always been how he operated, but by Aldrich's network in the capital, where he had been waiting for news of a victory that wasn't coming. He was placed under crown custody without ceremony and without the kind of dramatic confrontation that his position in the story might have warranted. He was simply found and taken, a man who had spent money and positioned assets and built architecture over years, sitting in a comfortable room waiting to see if it worked, and it hadn't worked, and now he was in custody. The anticlimactic nature of his arrest was, Seraphina thought, its own kind of information about power. The people who built the structures rarely stood in the structures when they came down. The formal trial was set for 30 days after the border was secured. Those 30 days were a different kind of difficult than the campaign had been. The campaign had been clear. Move fast, read the terrain, communicate the intelligence, support the decision makers. The 30 days after were the unclear kind. The days of navigating what she and Darian were to each other now. What Rowan's life was going to look like inside a palace structure he'd never known. What she was willing to build in a place that had already shown her once how completely it could be taken away. She slept in the Queen's quarters, which were adjacent to but separate from the King's. That had been her choice, and he had not questioned it. She handled the morning intelligence briefings with Aldrich and the afternoon policy consultations with the Pack Lords and the evenings with Rowan, and Darian moved through the same days in parallel, present, functional, careful with the distance she'd set. He was learning, she understood, to read what she needed without requiring her to explain it. That was new. The Darian she'd known 4 years ago had been skilled at reading rooms and political situations and the tactical landscape. He had not been particularly skilled at reading her specifically, which she'd attributed at the time to the particular blindness that came with the kind of certainty he'd carried. He was not certain in the same way now. The certainty had been replaced by something more expensive and more useful: attention. On the 12th day of the 30, she was in the small garden off the Queen's quarters when she heard him at the entrance and didn't turn around. "He walked today," she said. 3 steps, and then sat down and looked at me like I'd done something to him. A pause. Then Darian moved into the garden, and she heard him settle on the bench at a distance that was respectful of the geometry she'd established. "You missed it," she said. She said it without accusation. It was simply true. "Yes," he said. "You'll miss things for a while," she said. "He's going to move fast now that he's started." "I know." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the garden, not at her, giving her the choice of where the conversation went. She studied his profile for a moment, the jaw Rowan had apparently inherited, the particular way he held tension in his shoulders, that she had once known well enough to read before he knew he was showing it. He was showing it now. The tension of a man who wanted to say something and had decided not to because the timing wasn't his to control. "Say it," she said. He looked at her. "I want to be here." Not in the policy sense, not in the succession and crown sense. I want to be here for the 3 steps and the sitting down and the look. He held her gaze. I know I don't get to want that as though it's uncomplicated. I know there's a gap between what I want and what I've earned. I'm not asking you to close it on my schedule. I'm telling you the want exists because you asked me to say it, and I'm done managing what I tell you. She looked at him for a long moment. Do you know what the hardest part was? She said. Not the exile, not the frontier winter, or the riders, or the mountain. The hardest part was that I had to do the right thing for him inside a situation that had no right answers in it, and every decision I made alone, with no one to check it against, because the person I would have checked things against was the person who'd put me there. He didn't look away. Yes. I'm not telling you that to wound you, she said. I'm telling you because you should know what the ledger looks like. Not the political ledger, the actual one. I know what the ledger looks like, he said. I've been looking at it for 14 months. Looking at it and understanding it aren't the same thing. No, he said. They're not. He was quiet for a moment. I chose paper over 7 years. I chose certainty over the person who'd earned the benefit of the doubt 100 times over. I chose it fast because I was afraid of what slowing down would cost me politically, and I dressed that fear up as decisiveness and called it strength. He stopped. It wasn't strength. It was the specific cowardice of a man who didn't want to look like he was choosing personally over politically in front of an audience. The directness of it caught her slightly off guard. She had prepared for a more managed version of this conversation. You've been rehearsing that, she said. For about 11 months, he said. She almost smiled. She didn't, but it was close. I'm not ready to close the gap, she said. I want to be clear about that. What we're doing right now, the parallel tracks, the briefings, the operational coordination, that's what I can do right now. I don't know yet what comes after that. That's enough, he said. Immediately, without qualification. She studied him. You mean that? I mean it. His voice was even. I spent 7 years being certain about things before I'd fully earned the certainty. I'm not doing that anymore. You tell me when the distance changes. I'll be here in the meantime. She looked at him for a long moment in the garden, in the thin afternoon light, with the sound of the palace operating around them in its ordinary, complicated way. And she thought about 14 months of making every decision alone. And she thought about 3 steps and a hard sit-down. And she thought about what trust looked like when it wasn't dressed up as something sentimental. When it was just the ongoing, daily, undramatic act of showing up and being useful and not requiring more than was being offered. Tomorrow morning, she said. The briefing is at 6. Be there on time. He nodded. Something in his face shifted. The unmanaged kind. And Darian, she said. He's going to walk again tomorrow, probably. Be in the garden at midday. She went back inside. The trial of Isolde Cavendry and Edric Valmont opened on the 30th day before the full council and all 6 pack lords. The public galleries were open. Seraphina had argued for that. Darian had agreed without debate. The crimes had been committed against the public architecture of the kingdom, against the crown, against the pact structure, against the legal and political systems that the kingdom's people depended on, and the accounting for those crimes should happen where the people could observe it. Cavendry's legal representation was skilled to the end. They challenged the forger's testimony on procedural grounds and mounted a legitimate argument about the evidentiary chain in the financial records. It cost the prosecution 3 additional days of documentation and 2 supplementary witnesses. Seraphina sat through every hour of it with the same attention she'd brought to every difficult thing, fully present, tracking every thread, prepared to respond if the situation required it. On the 4th day, the forger's testimony was sustained. On the 6th day, the financial connection to Valmont was confirmed by the council's independent investigators, whose conclusions could not be challenged on procedural grounds because Darian had insisted on the independent structure specifically to prevent that. On the 8th day, the council delivered its findings. Cavendry was stripped of her title and holdings and permanently exiled from the kingdom's territories. The same instrument used against Seraphina applied now to the woman who had designed it. Valmont's assets were seized and his financial network dismantled. The separatist faction, deprived of its funding architecture and its constitutional argument, fractured within 2 weeks of the verdict. On the day the verdict was delivered, in the corridor outside the council chamber, Cavendry passed Seraphina on her way to the escorts who would take her from the palace. She stopped. Seraphina stopped. The two women looked at each other. Cavendry's composure was intact. It had been intact through 8 days of trial. But up close, in the corridor light, Seraphina could see what composure was costing her. The particular tightness around the eyes of someone who had been performing steadiness for so long that the performance had become structural. There was nothing to say that would have been adequate. Seraphina didn't try. She held Cavendry's gaze for exactly as long as it took the other woman to accept that no exchange was coming, and then she stepped aside and let her pass. She watched her go. She thought about 2 years of patience and precision, an asset inside the court building, a trap layer by layer, and she thought about how the capacity that had made Cavendry dangerous, the long view, the architectural thinking, the willingness to work years toward an outcome, was not in itself a corrupt capacity. It was a human one. Turned in a different direction, it would have been formidable in service of something legitimate. She didn't forgive Cavendry. Forgiveness was a different instrument than understanding, and she didn't confuse them. But she let herself understand what she'd been dealing with. It was more useful than contempt, and she had always been practical about what was useful. The council review of the exile prohibition concluded 3 weeks after the trial. The finding acknowledged that Darian had acted on fraudulent evidence and that the procedural failures, the absence of inquiry, the denial of defense, constituted a misuse of Crown authority. The formal censure was recorded. Darian accepted it without appeal or mitigation, standing in the council chamber with the same straightness he'd stood with when he'd issued the original order 14 months ago. And the pack lords observed a king being formally held accountable by the structure he was supposed to govern. And what Seraphina saw in Brennan's face was not satisfaction or vindication. It was something closer to respect, the difficult kind, the kind that got earned through exactly this. That evening, for the first time, she let Darian put Rowan to sleep. She sat in the corridor outside the nursery and listened to him trying and failing to figure out the specific motion that Rowan settled to, and she heard Rowan's increasing vocal commentary on the inadequacy of the attempt, and she heard Darian speaking to him quietly in the tone of someone genuinely uncertain and unwilling to fake it, and after about 15 minutes, the vocal commentary stopped. She sat in the corridor for a while longer. Then she got up and walked back to her quarters through the palace hallways, and the night staff moved around her with the ordinary efficiency of a household at rest, and the torches were low along the corridor walls, and the palace that had felt like borrowed space for 4 years felt, in the particular quiet of that late evening, like something different. Not reclaimed. She was too precise a thinker to use that word, with its implication of returning to something unchanged. More like a place that she and it had both been through enough to have a different relationship with each other now. Less ideal. More honest. She stopped at the window at the end of the corridor. The capital was quiet below. She looked north, the habit of 14 months, the direction she'd walked toward when everything in the other directions had closed, and she let herself look at the full length of what had happened, not as a wound and not as a triumph, but as the complete and complicated shape of it, start to finish. She had been a Luna who believed her bond was unbreakable and discovered it could be broken by the right combination of fraud and certainty and fear. She had survived a frontier winter with no resources and a pregnancy she was managing alone in Riders in the Dark. She had built a life in Veltholm, in Iron Hollow, with people who had asked only whether she was useful and found that she was. She had raised her son in the honest country, where things were what they appeared to be, and she had walked back into the dishonest country when it required her to, because the alternative was to let the wrong people win. She was 27 years old. She had a son who had walked 3 steps and sat down with the expression of someone holding an entire world accountable for the physics of it. She had a kingdom that had been fractured and was currently being rebuilt, which was harder than building it the first time because the rebuild required an accounting for every point of failure. She had a man 3 rooms down who was learning, at some cost to the certainty that had previously defined him, how to be present without requiring more than was offered. She did not know yet what she was going to build out of all of this. That was the truth, and she was not afraid of it. She knew what she was going to do tomorrow. Briefing at 6. Garden at midday. The incremental specific work of putting things back together, not back the way they had been, which was not a possible destination, but forward into something that had the fractures incorporated into its structure rather than hidden behind the surface. Things that had broken and been rebuilt around the break were sometimes stronger at the break point. Not always, but sometimes, and only if the rebuild was honest about where the break had been. She turned from the window. Darian was in the corridor. He had come from the direction of the nursery, and he stopped when he saw her, and they stood in the torch-lit corridor with the distance between them that she'd set and he'd respected. "He's down," Darian said. "I heard. It took longer than I expected." "It always takes longer than you expect," she said. "That's the thing nobody tells you." He nodded. He looked at her with the attention she'd been watching him develop, the kind that didn't require her to explain herself, that was content to observe and wait. "You should sleep," she said. "The Western Territory meeting is at 7. "I know." Neither of them moved for a moment. "Darian," she said. "Yes." "You did something today that kings don't generally do," she said. "Standing in there and letting the censure land, not managing it, not mitigating it." "It was warranted," he said. "Most warranted things don't happen," she said. "That's what makes them warranted." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about the difference," he said, "between the man who stood in the Great Hall and made that decision in 60 seconds and the man who stood in the council chamber today. I've been trying to understand what actually changed, because I don't think it was just the evidence. I think I had enough to question the evidence even then, if I'd wanted to slow down." He paused. "I think I was afraid that if I chose you over the political cost, I'd lose something I'd built. I didn't understand yet that the thing I was choosing was the thing that held everything else together." She looked at him in the corridor light and thought about what it cost a man who had been built for certainty to sit with the long view of his own failure, not the managed version, not the political narrative, but the actual interior accounting of what he'd done and why, and what it had cost other people. "Go to sleep," she said. 7 o'clock. He nodded. He walked past her toward his quarters, and she watched him go. She stood in the corridor for a moment longer. From the nursery, no sound. Rowan sleeping the deep sleep of a child who had expended significant energy on the project of locomotion and commentary. She went to her own room. She did not fall asleep immediately. She lay in the dark and listened to the palace at rest and thought about Maren, who was in Veldholm with the frost coming back to the ridge, and probably splitting wood by now, who had sent a 2-word note to a woman she didn't know because her brother had reported she'd walked out of a room without showing them she was hurt. She would write to Maren. She had been composing the letter in the back of her mind for weeks. There were things that deserved to be said directly to the people who had held the line, while everything else was uncertain. She thought about Rowan taking 3 steps and sitting down hard, and looking at her with his father's jaw, and her way of going still, and an expression that was purely his own, not inherited from either line, already entirely specific to this particular person. She thought about what kind of world she was going to put around that person as he grew. Not the perfect world, which didn't exist, but a world that was honest about its fractures, and accountable for them, and in the process of rebuilding them into something stronger. She was going to do that. She was going to do it in this palace, in this kingdom, with its complicated history, and the man 3 rooms down who was learning at real cost to be a different version of himself. Not because she had forgiven everything, not because the ledger was clear, because the alternative was to walk away from the rebuild and let someone else determine what got put back and how, and she had never in her life been able to make herself do that. She closed her eyes. Outside, the capital was quiet. The border was quiet. 3 rooms down, her son slept the sleep of someone who had walked today for the first time, and would walk further tomorrow and further still the day after that. Because that was what people did. They found their feet and they moved, even when the ground was uncertain, even when the first attempt ended in a hard sit-down. They got up and they moved forward, and the moving was not graceful, and it was not guaranteed, and it was not the same as what had come before. It was its own thing, and it was enough. Years later, not many, but enough for the wolf pups of the outer territories to have grown up knowing only a kingdom at peace, enough for the eastern border to have been quiet so long that the breach points had been converted to trade posts, A boy with gray eyes and 3 words of opinion about everything stood at the edge of the palace training ground and watched his father run the morning drills with a seriousness that made the men around him stand a little straighter. He had his mother's way of watching, still and complete, absorbing everything before deciding what to do with it. He had his father's jaw. The jaw would cause trouble someday, his mother had told him, with the particular expression she wore when she was saying something that sounded like a warning and was actually something more complicated. He was 6 years old and he had grown up knowing 2 things equally: that the kingdom he would someday be responsible for had been broken and rebuilt, and that the people who had broken it and the people who had rebuilt it were human in both instances, capable of both in the same lifetime, which was the most important thing about them. His mother came to stand beside him at the training ground fence. She did not look at him. She looked at the drill below. "What are you watching for?" she said. "The gap in the 3rd formation," he said. "Same place as yesterday." She looked. She saw it. "What would you do about it?" He told her. She listened to the whole thing before she responded, which she always did, which he had learned to expect and would have noticed if it ever changed. "Close," she said. "But you're thinking about the gap as the problem. The gap is the symptom. What's causing it?" He thought about it. Below them, his father called a correction to the drill line, and the gap closed, and Rowan watched it close and understood something new about what his mother was asking. "The formation to the left," he said. "It's pulling." "Yes," she said. He looked up at her. She was looking at the drill with the expression she wore when she was satisfied and wasn't going to say so directly, which was the same as saying so in its own way. "You're going to make me say it," he said. "You already said it," she said. "Now you know it." Below, his father looked up from the drill line and saw them at the fence. Something moved in his face. The unmanaged kind, the kind that happened every time. Still, after 6 years, when he came around a corner and found them somewhere he hadn't expected. He raised a hand. Rowan raised his back. His mother watched the exchange. Then she looked at Rowan. "Come on," she said. "You have a map session after this." He fell into step beside her, and they walked back through the training ground toward the palace. And the morning was clear and cold with the first edge of autumn in it, and the kingdom moved around them in its ordinary way. Not perfect, not without its fractures, not the same as it had been before the years that had broken it, but present, functional, rebuilt with the breaks incorporated, which made it, at those points specifically, stronger than it had ever been before. Seraphina Vale walked back into her palace with her son beside her and the cool morning air in her lungs, and she did not look back, because there was nothing behind her she hadn't already reckoned with. She looked forward. That had always been the only direction worth moving.